You're now watching the Mystical Green Beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and I've been getting caught up on a lot of reading as of late. I mean, it's not like I can do anything else, right? And my reading pile has been pretty scarce of any content not related to DC Comics, and that's not because I don't read comics from other publishers. In fact, the majority of my current pull list is indie titles, but let's be real here, my channel's not big enough to put a proper spotlight on indie content right now. As much as I'd love to hype up comics like Something is Killing the Children, or Monstrous, or Vampirella by Christopher Priest, and so on, I know that those videos wouldn't do too well on here. So in today's video, instead of talking about indie comics that are really good that nobody else is talking about and or reading, let's talk about Marvel comics that are really good that nobody is talking about and or reading. Because today, we're talking about Daredevil by Chip Zdarsky, Marco Checcetto, and Shama. I mean, there's other people involved too, like the letterers and the inkers and the colorist, but I'm sorry, that's a lot of names. But just know that you and your efforts on this book are much appreciated as well. And the reason I made that joke about this book being only read or talked about by me is because A, nobody I know who reads comics is reading this book. Even Daredevil fans aren't getting themselves hip to this run, which is a real shame because I feel like this run was tailor-made for Daredevil fans. No disrespect to the previous few creative teams, but so far, this might be my favorite run on the character since Bendis and Maleev. And B, I know that Comic-Con is as reliable as medium rare chicken, because not only does it not accurately tell you how many units were actually sold in stores, but it doesn't give you any analytics on digital sales, which makes no sense to me, considering that we live in the 21st century. But it's all we got for right now, and these sales are not looking too good, especially for the level of quality that this book has. So, getting right into it, this book scratches a multitude of itches for me when it comes down to what I want from a Daredevil book. First and foremost, it's a gritty street-level crime drama that actually remembers that it takes place in the Marvel Universe. Like, in terms of the general tone, this feels like Miller and Jansen in a way that Daredevil hasn't felt like Miller and Jansen in quite a long time. Because something that I think people forget about Frank Miller's Daredevil is that, while yes, the book is a gritty street-level crime drama, it's also wild as fuck, and is the opposite of grounded. Which is great because, you know, it's a comic book with superheroes. But yeah, so getting into the actual story of the story, the general premise behind this run is that Matt accidentally kills a man, and he quits being Daredevil because of it. And from there, Zdarsky and company get a lot of mileage out of that concept. And they really get to the heart of who Matt Murdock is, not just as a superhero, but as a man of the law, as well as a Catholic. And straight up, Zdarsky gets this character. You know, he gets Daredevil in the same way that he gets Spider-Man. Which is to say, not only is Chip Zdarsky the ideal writer for Spider-Man, but he's also the ideal writer for Daredevil. But what's really refreshing about Chip Zdarsky, or just based off what I've seen of his work so far, he's totally willing to swing a sledgehammer at an established character's nuts and depict them at their lowest of lows, and even sometimes depict them in an unfavorable light. But it never feels like he's throwing characters under the bus for the sake of stamping his name on it and saying, "Herb derp, look at me, I'm edgy, I did that thing." It feels deserved, and it also feels believable and earned. But I digress. Okay, so let's rewind for a second. Now, in the previous run by Charles Soule, and I think Phil Noto was the artist he was working with, that run ends with Matt Murdock getting hit by a truck, and it's kind of left to the reader's interpretation of whether or not he dies. But, 19 issues into this new Daredevil comic, I'm reasonably sure that Matt got better. But it's important to note that at the beginning of this run, Matt is not fully recovered from his accident, and he is not 100%. So in the first issue, he's getting back into the swing of things, you know, hooking up with hot bitches and being needlessly standoffish, which pushes them away. And he's wearing the classic Daredevil costume, and he's kicking the asses in Hell's Kitchen that need to be kicked. But when it comes to that second part, he's still trying to get back into his groove, and because of this, he almost gets himself killed by a bunch of random nobodies who are robbing a liquor store. And in the fight, this is the part where Matt but, you know, on accident. And after the news breaks that Daredevil murdered someone, obviously Matt thinks that the Kingpin, who's the mayor of the city at this point, is trying to set him up. And it's around this time that a new detective is transferred into New York City named Cole North. And he has a serious problem with the NYPD allowing vigilantes to run rampant and fight crime for them because he's from Chicago, where the only thing that their police force allows to run rampant is crime itself. So now that Daredevil's reputation has been tainted and is now on the run from Detective North, he does what he can to repent, because Catholic guilt. But it's weird because his penance for killing a man is beating other criminals within an inch of their lives. But what else can you expect from Matt Murdock? For him to double down on his day job and help his community? But seriously, after Matt tries to investigate the death of a man he murdered, because he's still tricking himself into believing that he didn't kill him, he runs into Detective North, and they have a legit street fight. And I love the scene because, look, I know it's sappy, but I really like it in superhero comics when there's a clear relationship between the hero and the city. And when Detective North tries to arrest Daredevil, the other cops just aren't on board. Hell, after Matt gets his ass beat by North in their beautifully choreographed street fight and is being hauled off into a police cruiser, one of the other cops stops him from pulling off Daredevil's mask. And he gives him this speech about how New York cops have a respect for these vigilantes, and that right off the bat, he knows that North is clearly not a New Yorker. But before Daredevil's hauled off to the station, he's rescued by the Punisher. And there's this whole issue where Frank is happy that Daredevil's finally seen the light, and it's really cool, and it ends with Matt just embarrassing Frank in a fist fight and blowing up his headquarters. Then we cut to the Owl trying to run some weapons, because in that Punisher issue, some thug that Frank was interrogating let it slip that the Owl was planning something big. So we get to see Matt rough up the Owl's operation, and he ends up blowing up the factory, and he almost gets himself killed. But thankfully, the heroes for hire are there, and they show up and they rescue him. And again, this is where Zdarsky shines, because at this point, Matt has finally accepted the fact that he's killed a man. And when his friends try to tell him to lighten up because these things just sort of happen in their line of work, Matt freaks out at them, and he calls them all murderers, and he runs away. Which is kind of a spazoid douchebag thing to do, but that's also weirdly perfectly in keeping with the self-destructive and somewhat holier-than-thou nature of the character. And after he gets home, he's confronted by Spider-Man, and Spidey's like, "You're done." And he gives Matt the same talk that Jessica, Luke, and Danny had earlier about how sometimes these things just happen, but then he tells him that his behavior in light of accidentally killing someone is just unacceptable. You know, getting into street fights with cops, blowing up warehouses, it's just too much. Especially with the Kingpin being mayor currently, and there being an anti-vigilante mandate out there, making superheroes' jobs that much more difficult. And after that, Matt hangs it up, and he stops being Daredevil. So yeah, that's the first 5 issues. Everything after that is even crazier, because we actually get to peek behind the curtain at the Kingpin's life as the mayor, and how different his approach to crime is, and how he's not exactly enjoying himself, because he's no longer bumping elbows with mob bosses. Instead, he's hanging out with politicians and CEOs and corporate tycoons, and suddenly, he's in a situation where he's no longer the head honcho. Now he's surrounded with people who are just as powerful as he is, if not more powerful. And there's a really interesting fish out of water idea that Zdarsky and company are playing with Wilson, and how these big business types don't respect Wilson as the mayor, because he's very clearly a gangster who's trying to parade himself as something, well, other than a gangster. In fact, he has these two rivals, the Stromwin twins, and they're this brother-sister duo who run a tech firm, I think, and they're really great foils for Wilson, and there's a lot of really interesting parallels between Kingpin and Daredevil, where they're both out of their element throughout this whole series, with Wilson trying to leave his overt criminal nature and past behind him, and Matt trying to leave Daredevil behind him. But they just can't do it. Actually, Matt goes back to being a vigilante, but he's not wearing the Daredevil costume because Daredevil died on the night that he killed that random thug, who does wind up being very important to the series, by the way, and it's kind of brilliant and really tragic, but that's something that I don't want to spoil in case you decide to read this book, because you should read this book, and if you don't, well, I mean, there's really nothing I can do about that, but you're missing out. There's also this anybody can be Daredevil message that should be hokey and should be stupid, but isn't. Because after Matt quits being Daredevil, there's a bunch of people in Hell's Kitchen who start dressing up as Daredevil, and it's equal parts inspiring and tragic because a lot of these Daredevil impersonators try to stand up for their neighborhood, and it just doesn't go over too well. It's good to have balls. It's really important to have a nice pair of strong brass balls. But the Rhino can break your balls. Crossbones can crush your balls. Bullet will shoot your balls. Bullseye will snipe your balls. Stilt Man, yes, Stilt Man, who actually has a really cool design in this book, will stomp on your balls. Everyone in Hell's Kitchen is going to get their balls stomped on. And this is the point in the series where Matt kind of gets over himself, and he realizes that thing that I think every superhero does at some point. Daredevil is bigger than Matt Murdock. Daredevil is a symbol that represents Hell's Kitchen, and he has to take responsibility for that symbol that he created, and he has to take back his neighborhood. But yeah, man, this book is just phenomenal so far, and I've barely scratched the surface of all the cool stuff in this book. I didn't even talk about the plot thread with Elektra coming back into Matt's life and how she's become his new stick and trains him to be as good as he once was. There's also a plot thread involving the crime families of New York fighting for power now that the Kingpin is no longer the Kingpin, and how Matt is having an affair with one of these mob bosses' daughter-in-laws. This is the craziest the Daredevil book has been in a long time. And I think it captures the spirit of what Frank Miller was doing back in the 70s and 80s, and manages to bring that tone into contemporary times. Then there's the art. Oh my god, the art. So, I really like it for the most part. Some of it gels with me, and some of it doesn't. Like, Marco Checcetto is brilliant, and I think his art is beautiful. I also really love his rendition of the Daredevil costume. His art is gritty, but also super stylized. It feels like a more street-level appropriate David Marquez, if that makes any sense. I also really dig Jorge Fornés. He puts me in mind of David Mazzucchelli really hard. In fact, I remember him fondly from his work on Tom King's Batman. And funny enough, much like Mazzucchelli, who did work on both Batman and Daredevil respectively, they both do a thing where their work on Daredevil and Batman are very different, despite working with similar subject matter, because their Batman looks more pulpy, while their art for Daredevil feels somewhat more cinematic. I don't know, I really enjoyed it, but like I said, I'm not a fan of all of the artwork, like Lalit Sharma. I see what they're going for, because it looks like a more contemporary Klaus Janson with a little bit of John Romita Jr. in there too, but it just wasn't working for me. But I'll chalk that up to tonal whiplash, because coming off of Checcetto and then going into Shawarma was just very jarring. Not bad, just visually jarring. But I'm also the kind of guy who just flat out prefers for there to be one artist to one writer on a run. Like, I understand that in order to keep a schedule, that can't always be the case, but it's just a pet peeve that I have with superhero comics in general. But yeah, all in all, I'm really into this series. This is my go-to book month to month. Hell, I'm even buying the trades for these outright, which I don't normally do with Marvel books because I feel like a lot of Marvel trades are overpriced, but this is well worth it to me. I'm absolutely loving this series, and if you haven't already, give this book a read. As of recording this right now, there are 19 issues in total, but by the time this video gets uploaded, issue 20 is probably out. Hell, who knows? Maybe issue 30 is probably out by now. Lord knows that if procrastination was a profession, I'd have that market monopolized. Even in the midst of a global pandemic when I literally have nothing else to do, this video's still probably gonna end up late. I know it. But that's besides the point. Are you reading Daredevil? If so, what are your thoughts on it? And if you're not reading Daredevil, you're a fucking loser. Kidding, just kidding. You're not a loser. I love you. But seriously, read this book. It's a wonderful treat if you're a Daredevil fan. Or if you're deaf, or if you're blind. I'm sure there's an audiobook version out there somewhere. You'll definitely like this book if you're Greek. Good God, if you're Greek. Oh my God, yes. Pure thoughts. Anyways, if you like this video, please show your appreciation by hitting the like button. Also, if you want to see more content, all you gotta do is subscribe. I am the Mystical Green Beanie. Thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.